Would you like to have a Warframe who clears entire rooms full of enemies with just one single button press? A Warframe who deletes foes by merely looking at them, all while at the same time being super duper tanky? Well, if all that sounds good to you, then oh boy does Gara have you covered. So, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna go into everything you need to know about Gara in 2025 and how to absolutely break her. Make sure to follow me on Twitch. We're live multiple times per week, link in the description down below. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. But you know the drill, let's first talk about Gara's abilities, and you'll want to start out with the passive, which is actually very darn simple. Every time you cast an ability, as you can also see here, there's a chance for enemies around you being radial blinded, sort of what Excalibur's second ability does. So yeah, that is kinda already it. Might be good if you're using some loadout that relies on having finisher kills, because enemies get open to finishers like this, but in general I personally don't think that it's all too synergistic with Gara's kit, so yeah. Ability number 1 is called Shattered Lash, and in my opinion, this is also Gara's bread and butter and her most important ability. This thing has basically two ways of functioning. Either you can tap the button and then throw a glass shard at enemies, or if you hold the button, then you're gonna swipe across the screen with a glass sword, knocking down every enemy in front of you. As you can see, in the middle of the screen, like other exalted weapons, you have a combo counter that increases every time you throw this at an enemy or use the blade function, and the higher the combo counter, as you can already see, the more damage you're actually getting out of it. Now, with this pseudo-exalted rework, also Shattered Lash from Gara, as you can see here, has become a moddable exalted weapon, so we can go and just put in all the melee mods that we want, but there is one thing to keep in mind, and that is that Shattered Lash cannot block, Shattered Lash cannot do any heavy attacks, therefore mods that are tied to those actions are also not available to mod here. We're gonna take a look at how to mod it and the more intricate details of it in just a second here. Just one very fun thing to note here, Shattered Lash can go through all types of walls, so you're damaging enemies even if they're not on screen, and that is incredibly strong. Shattered Lash also has an augment, but I want to talk about that a little bit later as it involves other abilities that we haven't talked about just yet, so don't worry, we're gonna get back to that in just a minute. Ability number 2 is called Splinter Storm, and this is also one of the most important things of your kit because it helps you to stay alive and can also deal crazy tons of damage. First of all, this ability can be activated either by aiming at an enemy, aiming at an ally, or just like this. If you aim it at an enemy and then shoot it at them, the enemy becomes a little more vulnerable to your damage, but I personally think it's pretty useless. If you shoot this at an ally, then the ally will get damage reduction, and this also works on defense targets, which makes it very good for defense type missions to keep that target alive, but I should say that the damage reduction is capped at a maximum of 50% in that case. However, that only goes for the defense target. If you activate that, then you can have up to a whopping 90% damage reduction, as you also see in the top right of the screen. And that means that Splinter Storm is one of the most important survival tools for Gara, because that 90% damage reduction does not only count on your health, but also on your shield, making shield tanking a viable survivability method for Gara too. Now, as you can also see, while the Splinter Storm is active, there's a little damage number in the bottom right of the screen, and that is because if you get close to enemies with your Splinter Storm, as you also see here, you push them away while dealing damage over time to them, that's because the splinters around you cut into the enemies. Right now, this damage is very low, but as we're gonna see later in the video, you can turn this into an absolute powerhouse and it is completely hilarious. Now, Splinter Storm also has an augment called Mending Splinters, which makes it that you get healed when targets are affected by Splinter Storm, but in my personal opinion, playing Gara into health tanking is not the ideal option, therefore you wouldn't need to be healed in the first place, and that is why I rather save up on the mod slot and not use this augment. Ability number 3 goes by the name Spectrorage, and I want to keep this a little bit shorter because I'm personally not too much of a fan, and I think if you want to use a helmet on Gara, then this is probably the slot where you want to put that in. What Spectrorage does is it creates an AoE where a circle of mirrors appears that distracts enemies to make them shoot at the mirrors and also redirect the damage. But again, I personally think you're gonna have enough crowd control and damage output for you to not need this ability per se. Now, Spectrorage also has an augment called Spectrosiphon, which makes it that when enemies die within the circle, they have a significantly increased chance of dropping energy orbs on death. As you can also see right here, once they do drop kinda sorta a lot of energy orbs. And while that is a viable tactic for Gara to get some energy back, I again am not too big of a fan of it, because not only does this require that you allocate one mod slot for the augment, but it also needs you to constantly cast this ability, and in my opinion, a tool to gain energy back that requires you to use energy to cast it in the first place is not the ideal situation, because you can't do it when you're on 0 energy, and instead we can throw out the third ability altogether and just use the equilibrium mod instead of the augment that also solves all our energy issues and has no added requirements. But now, let's talk about Gara's fourth ability, the big ultimate called Mass Vitrify, and this is a very cool tool that does a whole lot of things. At base, when you cast it, Gara will go into a prolonged casting animation that creates a circle of glass around you that expands over time. As you saw, this took quite a minute, but you can also preemptively cancel it by pressing the ability button again. Just one thing to keep in mind is, if you cancel it earlier, then the circle will naturally be smaller, but while you are in the casting animation, you are completely invulnerable to all types of damage, meaning you can use this as a kind of sort of panic button if you get into a tricky situation. Now, one thing you could do is use this as a defensive tool in a maybe defense mission, because enemies cannot walk into the ring, as you can also see here, and they can also not shoot through the ring. However, this glass wall can break, so keep in mind that this might not last forever, especially at higher levels. One thing that is much more interesting though is, if you cast it over the enemies, then as you can also see right here, they get glassed and get slowed down until they come to a complete halt. They're now stunned and they cannot do anything, all while at the same time, those glassed enemies get additional damage vulnerability, meaning they take more damage from you if you slap them around, and they can also not even get up if you push them to the ground, because they're immobilized. Now, that will be it for the base functionality of your 4, but there is a specific certain interaction for Gara that you absolutely have to know when you play her, and that involves 3 different of your abilities, which means now that we've talked about all of our skills, we can get into that. When your second skill, the Splinter Storm that gives you damage reduction, when that is on, that has a timer, as you can also see at the bottom right of the screen. Splinter Storm cannot be recasted. As you can also see right here, while it is on, I cannot press the button again to refresh the duration. What I can do, however, is cast my 4th ability, and that will, as you just saw, increase the duration of the Splinter Storm back to its maximum. Up next, I want you to take a quick look at the damage of our Splinter Storm in the bottom right corner of the screen, which is only at 300. If you create a glass wall, and then throw your first ability at the glass wall, you make it burst and deal AoE damage to all enemies that are close to the glass wall. And not just that, once you burst that glass wall, a portion of the damage that the burst of the glass wall deals will be added to the damage over time of your Splinter Storm. This damage over time value can be increased infinitely by spamming the glass wall. You can get millions and millions of damage into your Splinter Storm, which turns it actually into a very viable damage dealing tool. Now, as I just said, the damage increase for your Splinter Storm is based on how much damage the burst of your glass ring deals to enemies. And there are multiple ways of increasing that, so it doesn't take forever to scale up to the millions of damage that you want. First of all, the damage that you're getting is based on the combo counter and combo multiplier of your first ability. So getting that up to the maximum of 12x is essential to have that scale up faster. However, that is not the only thing we can do. Also, the damage of the burst of your glass ring scales with both the base damage that is modded onto your Shattered Lash, as well as all types of elemental damage. So, for example, we can take a look at this and build it as something like this, with a whole lot of elemental damage and all types of base damage, with Prime Pressure Point, all the 90% elemental damage mods, and as you can also see here, have a whole lot of maximum damage number on that thing. All of a sudden, we get 140,000 damage with just one cast. Oh yeah, and before I forget it, let me quickly go back to the augment for your first ability. Now that we've explained this whole interaction, when you blow up the glass circle from your 4 by using your first ability, then with the augment, that makes it that the damage you've stored in your Splinter Storm, that will be dealt to all the enemies hit by the explosion of the glass ring. But then again, we can already delete enemies no problem with either our first ability or by running into them. I personally think it's not all too necessary in today's day and age. And as always, if you could maybe leave a little like for the video, that would be super duper nice because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. But so much for Gara's skill and her base kit. Let's now, before we jump into the builds, first take a look at Gara's Shattered Lash and go over what you need to keep in mind when building it to get the most damage out of it. First, when we take a look at the base stats, we have some pretty decent stuff to work with. We have a 20% crit chance with a 2x multiplier, which is okay, but a status chance of 30%, which is quite a lot, and that is nice. As I previously said, this ability has two different functionalities, one where you throw the glass shard, and then the second one where you swipe over the screen, and this is also reflected in the stats, where if you throw the shard, you're dealing pure puncture damage, whereas with the slash movement, you deal pure slash damage. And if you want to use your one to deal all the damage for you, then the slash swipe is ideally what you want to go for, because they hit much more enemies and slash damage is generally just better than puncture. One more very important thing to mention here is that the range that you have on this ability not only scales with your melee range mods, like for example Reach, but also with the ability range that you have modded onto Gara herself. So because of the fact that this blade can go through walls, you ideally want to make sure to have a lot of range on your Gara, because that essentially means you can hit enemies that are not even close to being on screen. But now, when it comes to modding Shattered Lash, there are, in my opinion, two viable ways to go for here. Of course, the stat stick that I just showed, if you just want your Shattered Lash to make sure you're dealing as much damage as possible with your Splinter Storm. But if you want to focus more on, Shattered Lash itself, then we can either go for a slash damage over time build, like this one right here, or of course for a melee influence build, where we focus on electricity and melee influence to have even more of a damage spread present. Let's first talk a little bit about the slash DOT build. The only thing that I want to go into here that is important would be melee afflictions, which makes it that whenever you knock down an enemy and they have damage over time effects on them, those damage over time effects will get 6 additional stacks. And because the swipe of the sword knocks down the enemies, this actually applies here. As you can also see, enemies affected by it have 7 slash procs on them, even though we by ourselves only inflicted 1. Now, when it comes to the melee influence build, not too much changes, right? We're still going for damage over time with electricity this time, so we still have Elementalist, we still have a faction damage mod, yada yada yada, pretty self-explanatory right here. This is, by the way, also the type of build that you want to use on your one if you want to delete enemies so fast that they don't even show up on the minimap anymore, because you can hit them through walls, plus melee influence spreads the damage even further, and that can room nuke so hard that enemies will take some time to even get back to you afterwards. But alright, now that we know what Gara can do and also how her Shattered Lash works and how to get the most damage out of it, let's take a look at the actual Gara builds themselves now, and here I have 2 prepared for you today. One is, of course, focused on using your Shattered Lash as your main weapon to deal just tons of damage, and the second one, in my opinion, is the more funny and more interesting version to play her, because this one focuses on your Splinter Storm that we also explained in detail, scaling up the damage of it very quickly, and then just deleting enemies by purely running near them without having to do anything at all. Let's though start out with the Shattered Lash build first, because I think that's what most people probably want to go for. The way this works is incredibly simple. Once the mission starts, you cast your second ability purely for the 90% damage reduction to become much more tanky. And then, once you see the enemies, you just start using your one to attack them. This thing 100% hits through walls, so you're deleting everything even though you're not seeing it at all. Now, for the basics of this build, this is already everything you need to know. If you wanted to, you could use your 4th ability, either to extend the duration of your 2, or to just make enemies more vulnerable to your damage. And then for your 3rd ability, I personally think you don't need it, which is why I subsumed over it, with something like, in my case, Wrathful Advance. You can now deal red crits and kill enemies even faster. But we're gonna get into other helmet options in a second here. First of all, as I just showcased, we can of course go for Wrathful Advance from Kalervo, giving us much more crit chance on our Shattered Lash. One thing that I also like a lot would be Mirage's Eclipse, because this gives you another layer of damage reduction, therefore can make you very tanky, even tanky enough to survive Deep Archimedia, no problem. But, of course, if you just wanted to max out your damage potential, you can always go for Rhino's Roar, because Rhino's Roar is like the universal damage increasing ability. Grendel's Nourish to have even more headroom when it comes to energy economy. Now let's quickly also take a look at the Archon charts, where you have multiple options. If you just want to deal as much damage as possible with your Shattered Lash, then going for purple ones into more melee crit damage is definitely one option to go for. But if you didn't want to invest that highly into it, you can always go for more red shards into ability strength. That can never hurt, and especially if you're planning to use maybe your 4th ability a little bit more often, I would highly recommend going for 2 yellows into casting speed, because otherwise the casting animation of your 4 just takes absolutely forever. But now, let's take a look at the Gara build itself, and here I want to start out with our survivability. You can, of course, play her as a health tank, but personally I don't like it all that much on her. One other thing that is totally viable on her too would be shield gating, especially given the fact that her 4th ability makes you invincible while you're casting it. But today I decided to go for maximum convenience and turn Gara into a shield tank, because she gets so much damage reduction that shield tanking is actually viable. So what we do here is of course primed redirection to increase our shield to around about 1000. Then we get 90% damage reduction from our 2nd ability. We put adaptation onto her to stack another layer of damage reduction. And then I went for Arcane Aegis, which is very cool on shield tanking builds, and it makes Gara hella tanky. For our energy economy, we go with Prime Flow to increase our maximum energy, plus Equilibrium for the energy recharge, pretty standard stuff here. And then the rest of the build is focused on having a healthy balance between ability strength, range, and duration. So what we want to go for is Growing Power in the Aura for 25% ability strength, Mold Augmented for another 60% ability strength once it is stacked up, and then the last strength mod I used would be Augur Secrets, but you're free to use here whatever you like. If you're not concerned about efficiency, then Blind Rage is totally possible here. Transient Fortitude too, if you don't mind a little bit of loss in duration. Or you could even go so far to use Energy Conversion. This is all perfectly viable too. For the duration part, we just go for Prime Continuity and that's it. And then finally, to get a little bit of range, I went for Stretch, but you could also, if you wanted to have more range, replace this with Overextended. Does cost you a little bit in strength, so if you do that, I would actually recommend replacing Augur Secrets with Blind Rage to sort of balance that out. Looking at your companion options, it doesn't really matter because Gara doesn't need a specified companion. Nautilus Prime on this build is not that necessary because you're gonna kill enemies so far away so that Nautilus can't even attract them just yet. Same problem with the Panzerwelpe. Probably the enemies are gonna die before they even get into range here. So you can really go for whatever you like, maybe even an Adarza Kavat because it can bless you with even more crit chance. Just saying, might be a valuable option here because enemies don't need to be in range for it. Alright, but so much for the Shattered Lash build. I think that is a pretty standard way to play Gara. Let's now take a look at the more fun build, where you use your Splinter Storm to kill enemies by just coming close to them and then they just unalive themselves. The way this works is a little bit more complex and needs a minute or two to set up, but it's also not as bad as some people might believe. The first thing that you do once the mission starts is, of course, you use your Splinter Storm for the damage reduction, and then you want to try and stack up your combo multiplier on your Shattered Lash as quickly as possible. Then, once that's maxed out, you cast your 4th ability, then shoot your 1 into it. Rinse and repeat, and as you can also see in the bottom right corner, the damage of our Splinter Storm scales up very quickly by simply doing that. Now, once you've done this a couple of times, as you can also see right here, you're gonna have millions of damage stacked up in your Splinter Storm, and with Roar on, they all die in one hit by me just coming close, and that is incredibly crazy. Now, looking at the helmet options here, as I showed in the previous section, of course, you can go for Roar because it increases the damage of the ability, but maybe Nourish would also be a good idea just to make sure you're always good on energy. Just one thing I should absolutely mention here is, do not use Pull as a grouping tool, do not use Larva as a grouping tool, because in reality, there is a problem. Let me show you. See, for some reason, enemies, when they are ragdolled, do not get hit by the Splinter Storm. If I pull them in, they're on the floor in front of me, but I have to wait for them to get up before they actually take damage. For the Archon charts with this very build here, you absolutely gotta use at least 2 yellow ones for the casting speed, but for this build we wouldn't need any purple shards because melee crit damage doesn't help for the Splinter Storm, and instead I would just recommend going for the red ones to have more ability strength. Now, let's also here take a look at the build, where the survivability is exactly the same as with the previous one. Then, for the build itself, we gotta make sure to have as much range as possible, because with a lot of range, we increase the AoE around us in which the enemies get deleted when we come into contact. So, for this build, I go for stretch as well as overextended, but if you personally say, I'm okay with a little bit of less range and want more ability strength, then you could replace overextended with something like Augur Reach, for example. Then for the ability strength portion, we go with Blind Rage as well as Mold Augmented, Prime Flow and Equilibrium for the energy economy, and then very important, in the aura, I went for Steel Charge, which increases our melee damage, and that is very cool because the damage stacking of our Splinter Storm, as we previously mentioned, scales with the base and elemental damage on our Shatter Lash, therefore having Steel Charge to increase that is a very nice thing. However, one thing I do want to mention here in the companion section is, with this build and your Splinter Storm, I would highly recommend going for Nautilus, because Nautilus can actually group up enemies in a way that you want. Let me show you what I mean. See, unlike the grouping abilities that I previously showed, when Nautilus groups up enemies, they do not get ragdolled, which means they can instantly be damaged by our Splinter Storm. When we get closer, Nautilus pulls them in and boom, they instantly die. This would be an example build, not necessarily tailored to this very Gara, but overall pretty functional. And if you rather punch stuff to death, then definitely also check out my Atlas build guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycan Shepherd, OnDakaneo2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Ben Spence, Leo Morizaki, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.